So in this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to paint local color in a portrait. Now, this is going to be a little bit different than what I showed you in the landscape painting, because of course we're painting skin now, and this has its own challenges. Now, we're going to be using a group of colors, and I've developed this system as a way that I find to be very manageable, very clear to use. You'll have teachers teach you other ways to do different systems of color to use. Ultimately, you'll find one that works for you, but I think this is going to be a really clear system and will kind of give you a good understanding of how to paint skin. I'm going to be using several colors that I've set out on my palette. I've got titanium white, yellow ochre, cadmium red light, burnt sienna, and burnt umber. I've also got black because I might need to get really dark in some of these shadows. And the last color we're going to use is a cool color, which traditionally speaking is typically a blue, such as a ultramarine blue. I'm going to be using this green though, this permanent green deep, because I think it's really nice to use a color that's already existing somewhere in your composition, perhaps in your background, perhaps in your clothing. And I'm going to be using that color to mix in with all those other warm colors at some point to neutralize them. Because if you just paint with those ochres and reds and siennas, it's going to be very warm, very orangey, and look kind of like an Oompa Loompa. So I'm going to want to neutralize that a bit and kind of bring that into a more natural kind of territory. If you put too much of your cool color in, it'll neutralize it a lot, and the person might look kind of dead, right? Their skin becomes very grayish if you neutralize it. It becomes kind of dead looking. So, don't overdo it with a cool color unless you really want to stylize it and you're looking for something kind of, more stylistic for some reason. So, it's also really important that you use every single one of those colors. You don't substitute with other colors. I'll list you a couple substitutes here that you might be able to use. There's always somebody in my class every time who skips burnt sienna, for example, and they just go right to burnt umber, and their paintings had come out looking really muddy, and the person looked kind of dead again. So what I do is I usually hit all the highlights with the titanium white, and in this case, in my photograph that I'm working from here, there really isn't any point that's pure white. So I'm going to take some white and mix it with a little yellow ochre, and that's going to be the brightest highlight in the face, which will probably be on the nose, the cheeks, and some other areas here. Then I'm going to mix a little bit more yellow ochre in it, get the next darkest value, and paint all of those areas. Then I'll mix in maybe just pure yellow ochre and hit those areas. Then start putting a little cadmium red light and start hitting those areas, right? So the red light mixed with yellow ochre, and then go to pure reds, and on, getting darker and darker until I've hit all my shadows. The reason why I do this, why I don't just focus in one area, hitting the highlights to the shadows like here on the forehead, is because if I do that and then I go onto the cheek here and have to do the same thing over again, it just requires me to wash my brushes, to reapply colors that was just used. If you're going from dark then to the light, it just kind of results in paint that's kind of going to be muddy and your palette's going to get messy quicker. So I hit all the highlights at the same time, all the midtones at the same time, and all the shadows at the same time. So it's very systematic. And that's why I think this technique is a really great way to work to keep this kind of complicated task of painting human skin, to make it more manageable. Now, if you're painting somebody with darker skin, it's the same system. They're going to have all these same colors in their skin, right? It's still just melanin, right? The skin pigment. It's just people with darker skin just have more of it. So you're just going to kind of alter your balance to maybe use a little bit less of the lighter colors and maybe more of those midtones or shadow colors, right? They're still going to have highlights in their face that are going to be white. They're still going to have some warmth in the yellow ochres and the reds right around that. And if you jump right from the white and skip those warm colors, go right from white to those browns, you're going to have a very muddy looking face. It just isn't going to look natural at all. So you have to use that full range of colors here. And remember, they aren't just colors, they're values too. So let's get started right now. I'm going to take my white with a little yellow ochre, just a tiny dab in it, because it's just going to kind of make it kind of off-white. And my paint is going to be really kind of thin and watery still. If we're just doing local color, we'll get thicker in the next layers. And it's really important that you're using yellow ochre and not any other type of yellow. The yellow ochre is a kind of more neutral yellow. If you go with a cadmium yellow, it's just going to look too bright and orangey later on. And that really only works if the person in your photograph is being hit with a bright, intense orangey or yellow light. So, okay, hitting the some of these highlights here. And we can be a little loose right now. Don't worry too much if it just isn't exactly right on. If I go over the hair a little bit, that's fine, because we're painting kind of transparently. I should be able to see the hair marks through there still. Ideally, by the end of this pass, the white of the canvas is going to be totally gone. We should cover up everything that we see here with paint by the end of this pass. Usually there's a lot of highlight on the chin. It kind of sticks out. When you're painting the lips too, their skin too. They just are going to use the same colors, just a little bit more reddish warmth in there. So I'm still just giving it a little bit of a highlight there. Okay, so now I'm going to get into my next darkest value, which is going to have more yellow ochre in it. So anything that has that highlight, I'm going to kind of go around the edge of it using this color. All right, so it's like I'm surrounding the highlight with that next value. Next, I want to get into just some pure yellow ochre. Very close to it. If you need to go back and bring a little bit more highlight in, it's still very easy to at this point. It gets a little bit sloppier later on as you get darker colors. I'm kind of leaving the features alone for now. So at this point, I'm going to start putting in a little bit of cadmium red light, or in this case, I have naphthol red, which is fairly close to it in acrylic. And it's really important that you have a really warm red here, so it doesn't neutralize too much. There might be a little bit of white still left over on my palette in my brush. That's okay. This might make it a little bit more of a peachy color, and that's just fine. There might not be full blending that's happening yet. We're just doing local colors, so we're trying to get these close. They probably won't be exact yet. We'll hone it in the next couple of layers. As you can see, it already definitely looks too warm. Don't worry about it. Just trust me. This will turn out okay when we get into our cooler colors later on and neutralize this a bit. Don't be afraid to just go right over the eyebrows too. You can still see through them if your paint's thin enough, so really shouldn't be an issue at this point. Don't be afraid to overdo it on the red. It's going to get neutralized by the browns later on. Remember, this is a painting. We can be a little bit expressive with our colors and kind of overdo things a little bit. So we're going to have the core shadow running through here. All right, so there's a bit of a reflected highlight along this side of the cheek and the neck. So now I've got my reds in, and it's definitely looking very Oompa Loompa-ish right now. I think this is actually a really good point to start getting into the features such as the lips and the eyes, because those whites there are creating a lot of contrast and making it a little hard to see what the other colors should be. Like I said, the teeth are not going to be pure white. I'm going to probably make them a little bit yellowish because they're in shadow. I think this one might have just like a little bit of brownish in it because it's a bit more in shadow. There we go. So just trying to hit some of those relative values. For the whites of the eye, his are really in shadow. I'm going to mix a little burnt umber with a little bit ultramarine blue. This kind of makes a cool neutral, a grayish color. And just darken those whites up a little bit. I might darken them even more later on. There we go. That helps some. And I'm going to start dealing with the lips. Like I said, they're the same colors as we're going to see in the rest of the face. Just a little more pinkish, a little more red in there. So I thought this would be a nice time to deal with those before I start getting into my brown colors. A lot of times the highlight on the side of the bottom lip is going to kind of run into the skin color there. So I'm going to lighten that area up a little bit. They sort of blend together a bit, making them feel like they're connecting. Remember that the top lip is going to be more in shadow than the bottom lip. Okay, let's get on to some burnt sienna now. Or don't skip that burnt sienna step, really important. There might not be a lot of it, but it's vital to make the next step work out so it doesn't turn all muddy. I've put in the burnt sienna just about everywhere I think it needs to go. Sometimes you don't need to put the burnt sienna in because you don't need to go that dark. Maybe the person has a lot of light in them or is just really light-skinned. Sometimes you just have to go darker with it. So just pay attention to what it is you're trying to convey. I actually went darker in a few areas here, darkened up some areas that are shaded by the hat. I might add a little bit more shading to that even in the next layer. I think I'm ready for burnt umber. Like I said, you might not need to go to burnt umber if your person really has a lot of light on them. I'm going to get into the shadows with it. And before I do that, I want to point out that I've brought some burnt sienna into the lips and the eyebrows. Anywhere I think I might darken up later on, but I want to be a little careful about. Maybe I don't want to go in there right away with burnt umber. So I'm just being a little cautious about that. And I can always paint on top of it later on with some burnt umber to go darker. I'm trying to keep the burnt umber away from these lighter ochres and whites here. If the burnt umbers or the siennas get mixed into these whites and off-whites, then your paint tends to go really muddy. So the whole point of all this warmth is to separate the highlights from these shadows, right? So it's really important that those midtones are quite warm. And there you can see it as I add that burnt umber in there, just even a little bit, it quickly neutralizes those shadows. So that's why I was not worried, neutralizes those warms. That is why I am not worried about overdoing it on the red. And I think it's often kind of nice when that kind of peeks through anyways. Later on, when we add in our cool color, it's really going to knock down any of those remaining reds. So you don't have to worry about them at all being too strong. I've even gone in with a little bit of burnt sienna in the eyelashes and the lines between the eyelids, just because I felt it would be a little safer to do that first with burnt sienna rather than going right with burnt umber. Now I can feel like I can comfortably go in there. At this point with the hair, follow the general movement and direction of it. Keep it loose. I generally with the hair like to paint it last, so it's sitting on top of the face in the background. In this case, it's also kind of sitting on top of this part of the hat. I often start with the darkest parts because those are often kind of behind, right? They're kind of behind the ear, and then it's easier to paint those highlights on top. Painting brown hair, I'm going to be starting with the burnt umber and then coming in with some yellow ochre to get the midtones, and possibly in a few areas I may bring in a little bit of white to mix into the yellow ochre to bring in some highlights. But the vast majority of this hair that I'm looking at is pretty dark. I might even need to bring in some black into some of the shadows here. And probably at the very end, just to be kind of playful and have some fun with it, I'll bring in some of these greens that I've painted in, that I've borrowed from the background, and just put them in a kind of intuitive way, just anywhere where I think might, where I might see them in the photograph. It's kind of imaginative sort of color. I might put them in anywhere that I want to darken because it's going to mix that brown and get it even darker. I might also mix that green with a little bit of white and put in some of the highlights. We'll kind of see as we go. You can see here now I'm just putting in some of these highlights with yellow ochre. Just trying to capture some of the movement of those curls, a few spots. If you have more reddish hair, try burnt umber. Sorry, burnt sienna. You probably won't end up using too much red in red hair. It's usually not that red. Burnt sienna will usually do the job for you. But sometimes you might want to bring it in there if you need to make it more intense. If you're painting blonde hair, it's actually not yellow. That's like what we did when we were kids. Blonde hair usually has a lot of white in it. Try white, yellow ochre, and burnt umber. If you're painting gray hair, people who are older, just painting it simply black and white is going to make the hair very grayish, but it won't have any sort of relationship to the skin tone. I recommend bringing in some burnt umber as well. A little bit of warmth in the gray hair will connect to the skin tone and make it feel like the hair is really part of the person. Don't be afraid to bring cool colors into the hair, particularly in the shadows. Right? Oftentimes there are cools in the shadows, and just as an effect of the light. So whatever cool you're using elsewhere in your painting, this is a great opportunity to bring that in. If you're dealing with black hair, once again, think about what you can do to connect it to other parts of the painting. Bring some warmth into it, bring some cool into it, make it feel like it's connected to everything else that you're doing